My father left us a fortune, but my brother and I only fought over one thing: who got to take care of our mother. It happened about 8 months ago, right after we buried him, and I remember standing in that funeral home thinking that grief was supposed to bring my brother and me closer together, not tear us apart. But that's not what happened. Within a few weeks, it became clear that the hardest part wasn't losing our father, it was figuring out what to do with our mother now that he was gone. My name is Michael, I'm the younger one, and my brother Daniel is 3 years older than me. Growing up, we were always close in some ways and competitive in others, and most of that competition centered around our mother, Eleanor. It started small, the kind of thing most siblings go through: who got to sit next to her at dinner, who she praised more for bringing home good grades, who got the bigger half of dessert when she split it between us. But somehow that competition never really faded the way it does for most people. It just changed shape as we got older. I remember being maybe 10 years old, watching Daniel get praised for some school project, and feeling this tight knot in my chest, not because I didn't love my brother, but because some part of me had already decided that her attention was something to be earned, something limited, something I had to fight for. I don't think our mother ever meant to create that feeling in us, but it was there anyway, quiet and persistent, all the way through high school, through college, even after we both got married and started our own families in different parts of the state. Daniel lives about 40 minutes from our mother's house in Asheville, and I live almost 2 hours away because of my job, and I think that distance always made me feel like I had something to prove, like I had to work twice as hard to show that I loved her just as much as he did, even though I wasn't around as often. Every visit felt like it had to count for something. Every phone call felt like it needed to make up for the ones I'd missed. After our father passed, we sat down as a family to talk about what was next for our mother. She was 78 years old, and her health wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great either. She had a hard time getting around the house some days, she'd had a couple of falls in the past year, and the doctor said she really shouldn't be living alone anymore, at least not without someone checking on her regularly. And that's when everything started to shift between Daniel and me. Our father had left behind a pretty significant inheritance, a result of decades running his own construction business, and I want to be clear about something right from the start: neither Daniel nor I cared about that money, not really, not in the way people might assume when they hear two brothers are fighting after their father's death. What we cared about, what we were actually fighting over, was who got to be the one taking care of our mother. Daniel insisted that since he lived closer, it made the most sense for her to move in with him and his wife, into the spare room they'd already converted for guests. He said it logically, the way he says everything, like he'd already made up his mind before the conversation even started. And I understood the logic, I really did, but something in me just couldn't accept it, because I felt like I was the one who always had to fight to be seen, to be remembered, to be the son who showed up, and now here was Daniel, once again, positioning himself as the obvious choice. So I pushed back. I told him I wanted her to live with me instead, that my house had more space, that my wife worked from home and could check on her during the day while I was at work, that it would actually make more sense for our mother's daily life. Daniel didn't take that well. He accused me of trying to compete with him one more time, like I always had, like this was just another version of us as kids fighting over who sat closer to mom at the dinner table. The arguments started happening more and more, sometimes over the phone, sometimes in person when we'd both show up at our mother's house unannounced, each trying to convince her, each trying to make our case. I remember one evening, maybe 2 months after the funeral, when Daniel and I got into it right there in her kitchen, raising our voices, saying things we probably shouldn't have said, while our mother sat quietly at the table, watching us, not saying a word. I didn't think much of her silence that night. I was too caught up in proving my point, in making sure Daniel understood that I wasn't going to back down this time, that I wasn't going to let him make this decision for both of us the way he always seemed to do. Looking back now, I think that was the night something in her finally broke, watching her 2 grown sons act exactly like they had 30 years earlier, fighting over the same thing they'd always fought over, except now the stakes were so much higher. Because the next time we sat down together, all 3 of us, our mother finally spoke up, and what she said changed everything between Daniel and me. The days after that kitchen argument were some of the quietest I'd ever experienced with Daniel, and not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind where two people are living in the same family without actually speaking to each other. We texted only about logistics, who was driving mom to her doctor's appointment, who was picking up her groceries that week, nothing personal, nothing real. I remember calling my wife one night, venting about how stubborn Daniel was being, how he always assumed he knew what was best just because he lived closer, and she said something that stuck with me. She asked me if I was actually fighting for what was best for mom, or if I was still trying to win something that had started back when we were kids fighting over who got the bigger slice of cake. I didn't have a good answer for her that night, and it bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Around 3 weeks after that fight in the kitchen, our mother had another fall, this time in the bathroom, nothing life-threatening, just a bruised hip, but it scared all of us enough that Daniel and I ended up at the hospital waiting room at the same time, sitting 2 chairs apart, neither of us saying much beyond the basics. We watched the doctors come and go, we signed the same paperwork, we drank the same bad coffee from the vending machine, and somewhere in those few hours of shared worry, something between us started to soften, even if neither of us said it out loud yet. I remember looking over at Daniel at one point, his face pale and tired, and realizing he looked exactly as scared as I felt, and for a second, all that competition between us felt completely pointless. We weren't kids fighting over dessert anymore. We were 2 grown men, both terrified of losing the same person. That was the night our mother asked us both to come back to her house once she was discharged, instead of letting us drive separately like we usually did. She said she wanted to talk to us together, and something in her voice made both Daniel and I agree without arguing about it first, which was already different from how things had been going between us. When we got to the house, she didn't go straight to bed like the doctor recommended. Instead, she asked us to sit with her at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel and I had argued so many times before, and she said she had something she needed to say before she lost the nerve to say it. She started by telling us that she had watched us compete with each other our entire lives, and that she had let it happen for far too long without ever stepping in. She admitted that when we were boys, she sometimes praised one of us more than the other without realizing how much weight those small comments carried, how they followed us into adulthood and shaped the way we saw each other, even now, as grown men with families of our own. She told us she loved us both exactly the same, that there had never been a version of her life where one of us mattered more than the other, and that watching us fight over who got to take care of her now, after everything, was breaking her heart worse than losing our father ever could. Then she said something neither Daniel nor I expected. She told us the money from our father's estate had never meant anything to her, and she didn't want it to mean anything to either of us either. She said the only thing she wanted in whatever years she had left was to watch her 2 sons stop treating each other like rivals and start acting like brothers again, because once she was gone, there would be nothing left to compete over, no version of her love that either of us could win or lose. Daniel and I just sat there for a long moment, not saying anything, because for the first time in months, the noise of our competition had gone completely quiet, replaced by something a lot more honest, and honestly, a lot more painful to sit with. After she finished talking, she pushed herself up slowly from the table and walked over to the window that looked out over the backyard, the same yard where Daniel and I used to play as kids, and she said she wanted to keep living in that house, the one she'd shared with our father for almost 40 years, surrounded by the things that made her feel like herself. That's when Daniel looked over at me, and for the first time in months, it wasn't a look of competition, it was something closer to relief, like he'd been carrying the same weight I had and was finally allowed to put it down. He said, "I'll move in with her, since I'm closer, and you handle the finances, the upkeep on the house, anything she needs money for, since you've got more flexibility there." I told him that made sense, and that I'd come visit every chance I got, not because I had to, but because I actually wanted to. Then Daniel brought up the part of our father's inheritance neither of us had touched yet, the part we'd both been avoiding because it felt complicated, tied up in everything we'd been fighting about. He suggested we use it to start a foundation in our father's name, something that could help other families going through the same thing we'd just gone through, instead of letting it sit in an account collecting dust while we argued over who deserved it less. I told him that sounded exactly like something our father would have wanted, and for the first time since the funeral, we shook hands across that kitchen table, not as rivals competing for the same thing anymore, but as brothers who'd finally figured out what actually mattered.